Thank you, Mr. President. Ben Riley, President of the Young LNP in Queensland. This policy essentially comes down to putting trust into and respecting young people, something that our party has a proud history of. In my home state of Queensland, we have 5 young members of the Young LNP who have been elected to state parliament, 2 of which are now ministers. We have 4 members of the Brisbane City Council, and of course we have Wyatt Roy, the federal member for Longman. Now, that demonstrates the trust we put in young people. Another situation when the Howard government put trust in young people was when it introduced voluntary student unionism. It said that young people who are smart enough to get into university should be smart enough to make a decision as to whether or not they should join a student union. Now, unfortunately, the Labor Party have rolled that back with the introduction of their student services and amenities fees, the SSAF legislation. Now, this policy comes basically in 2 parts. I'd hope Part A is something that we can all agree on quite simply, just to reaffirm the support of the room in favour of VSU. Now, the innovation comes into Part B. The prevailing thought since the SSAF was introduced was that the only way we could go back to VSU is if we were to do it through federal legislation. Now, to do that, we'd obviously need to win a federal election, and we'd need to pass that through the Senate, which, as I'm sure those of us who remember, that's easier said than done. But the reason people have thought, well, we've had to do that federally rather than through a state system, is because of a perceived conflict through Section 109 of the Constitution, whereby the Commonwealth prevails over the states under an inconsistency. However, if we look a bit deeper, or look in more detail at the legislation, you'll note that the SSAF changes haven't actually repealed VSU in the sense that they've forced unionism. They've merely given permission. So under VSU, the legislation stated that universities, well, as a condition of their funding, universities were not allowed to charge a non-academic fee for amenities and essentially to join the student union. What has happened with the SSAF legislation is they've created an exemption and said if you charge their defined SSAF fee, you will not get that funding cut. So essentially they've given permission to charge the fee, but not forced to charge the fee. So if we look at the models that were introduced in a state level, the most notable of which would have been in WA. I think it was Sir Charles Court in 1977 introduced it before Brian Burke rolled it back, and then Richard Court brought it in before Gallup rolled it back. But what they did was through the individual university acts, so the University of WA Act or whatever university it was, under the powers that the state government has, or the powers it gives to the universities, such as to charge fees, they put in a clause, I suppose, to prevent the equivalent of an SSAF getting charged. So essentially Part B of this motion comes down to we're urging state governments all up the Western Seaboard and up the Eastern Seaboard under the individual university acts to introduce a provision banning universities from charging a student services and amenities fee, thereby reinforcing VSU or returning VSU to universities and giving that freedom of choice back to students and giving that trust and that respect to students. So I commend the motion and I hope you support it. Thank you.
I call on the seconder.
Thank you, Mr. President. Christian Street from the Tasmanian Division and Vice President of the Australian Liberal Students Federation. Firstly, I'd like to congratulate Ben and his colleagues on some excellent work in Menzies House over the past week. A fantastic article, and I commend it to the Council on this very topic. Some very good research as well, and I was very impressed. I don't plan to take too much of your time, Council, given that we're already over time, but what I will say is that VSU for young Liberals and Liberal students is a microcosm of the reason why we all joined the party in the first place. I'm talking about things such as freedom of choice. So the choice of whether or not to fund a student organisation or any organisation for that matter. I'm talking about freedom of association, not having to be a member of a union in order to be a student. It's almost a ticket to work situation, which we found so disgraceful previously, and I don't see why it should be any different for a student. And I'm also talking about freedom of expression, and the expression that is so often suppressed in these unions from dissenting views. I might remind Council as well of some of the money that the student services and amenities fees is likely to be spent on. When it gets to unions, there's nothing to stop that money from then going on to the National Union of Students. Now, the legislation might say that it's not to be spent for political purposes, but once it gets into the hands of the National Union of Students, we will end up seeing campaigns again, like the Abbott's Heaven, Your Hell campaign, which try to convince so many students that an Abbott-led government would be so bad for them. And it's an absolute disgrace, because what this government should be fighting for and will fight for is more affordable education, because they won't be charging students a SSAF fee. Leave politics and values aside for a second, and again we get back to education affordability, something that those on the left and something that these leftist student unions fight for so hard, and yet they go and they put a $300 a year fee onto students, but that's fine. Increasing fees isn't fine, but increasing money that they know that they're going to see in their back pocket in student unions is fine, and that is an absolute disgrace, Council. I'm going to be short and say this is an article of faith for the Young Liberal Movement of Australia, and it's an article of faith for the Australian Liberal Students Federation, and it ought to be repealed by whatever means necessary. So, Mr Barnett, Mr Newman, Mr O'Farrell, Mr Baillieu, now is the time to use those governing acts to repeal VSU, to take a stand for students, to take a stand for young people, make education more affordable, and show them that we really mean it when we say that we are for students and for young people. I commend the motion to Council.
Thank you, Mr President. I will keep it brief because it is the end of the day. I'll simply make the point that the greatest asset basically any university has, or that it can add to its student life, is the actual students itself. The best events that are ever held on campus are those that generally are put together by a bunch of students who get together, run on the smell of an oily rag, and are usually good fun. My history came from the University of Queensland. This year they joined together with the QUT guild there. They broke a world record for the world's largest toga party. In doing so, they used the entrepreneurialism that comes from our party. They got they got sponsors in. They sold tickets, they sold alcohol and all those things that you do. Got Guinness World Records to come along. Made a significant profit for doing so. So not only did it create an event, it didn't need to be subsidised by people. It was just done through entrepreneurialism and spirit. They made money, which then gave them a greater capacity to fund clubs and societies and support services and everything else. So, for instance, at the group of 8 students, they've got 30,000 to 40,000 students-ish for each of them. That's a key market that all sorts of businesses are trying to get into. The problem with the left is they don't want to make profit off events, or they don't want to use any type of thrift. They don't want to get private companies on campus. They want to be able to run their own food outlets. They want to be able to essentially do it with unionised staff that are paid far too much because they make it a closed shop. And because they want to be so ideologically stringent, they won't bring private enterprise on. What's happened, again, at the University of Queensland, when we first came into power there, they were losing about $500,000 each year. That's been turned around in the last 5 years, and it's now making a surplus over $1 million because Subway's been brought on, Burger Urge has been brought on, Boost Juice. So instead of losing money on food outlets, there's money coming in through rents. On top of that, that's increasing the capacity to be able to fund student services. And then added to that, on top of it, there's a greater range of food for students. So all of these, I guess, just by using entrepreneurialism and that entrepreneurial flair, has created opportunities for students because we haven't wanted to be ideologically pure, as the left do, in extracting that money from students. So VSU is a good thing. It is not mutually exclusive from a strong campus culture. Both can happen, but just not under the leftist model. So thank you. Please support the model.
Thank you. I put the motion. Those in favour? Against? Carried.